Okay, folks, so our next step is to link the international reserves that a central bank holds, that's its foreign exchange holdings, with the exchange rate. Um, so there's a nice discussion of this in Mankiw, page 378. Alternatively, my discussion, chapter 15, section 15.2, especially pages 10 and 11, might help you. I'd be very interested in your feedback on this. We're going to give you some simple examples. They're going to be mainly consistent with Mankiw. Now, the idea is that under a fixed exchange rate regime, the central bank fixes the exchange rate by intervening with purchases or sales of its foreign currency holdings, what we call its international reserves. So those sales, it does these transactions, purchasing or selling international reserves and selling or buying domestic currency um, in order to prevent the exchange rate from moving. So we're going to find that uh, anytime the central bank is experiencing pressures on the domestic currency to depreciate, the central bank will sell foreign exchange. It will buy domestic currency to prop the domestic currency up and to keep the exchange rate from prevent the exchange rate from depreciating against the foreign currency. That's the U.S. dollar. Now you might ask, well, why might that happen? Well, this helps importers. Okay, importers don't like to have a more depreciated currency. It keeps their imports cheap. And that means that we're shifting some demand. We're preventing the demand from being shifted from imports into the domestic economy, and that has a kind of an effect to cool down the economy. It reduces or keeps the pressures in the domestic economy to produce from rising, and that may even that may even prevent inflation from rising. Okay. On the other direction, if there are pressures on the domestic currency to appreciate, the central bank will buy foreign exchange and it will sell the domestic currency. That's the transaction. And why might it do that? Well, it may want to help exporters. So by preventing the exchange rate from appreciating, that is helpful. That makes exports more attractive. But also by preventing the exchange rate from appreciating, we're in a sense stimulating the economy. But also that may actually have some inflationary impacts if we have more economic activity, more stimulation. In either direction, there are pros and cons. So the other thing is that the changes in reserve holdings can reflect pressures from various angles. We can think of as pressures from the goods and services, the net export side, or the net capital flows. Let's think of that as an investor sentiment. So we're going to show you some examples of each of these. So let's say that we're in an initial position where we have balanced trade and we have no changes in reserves. So exports are 400 and imports are 400. Okay. Now let us suppose that we have an unexpected drop in export revenue. Okay. That means that exporters who typically come to the central bank and say, here are my dollars, I'd like to buy some domestic currency. They are now coming to the central bank and asking for less domestic currency. So the demand for domestic currency is falling. Okay, and if the central bank does not stand and offer to sell dollars at the initial and fixed exchange rate, there will be a depreciation of the currency. But instead, what's happening is that the central bank is preventing that depreciation by continuing to sell dollars at the initial fixed exchange rate. So this is a preventative action. That's the way to think about it. In the other direction, let's suppose that we have a sudden surge, like a windfall of exports. In this case, exporters will be coming with their dollars once again, and they'll be asking for more domestic currency. That would place pressures on the value of the domestic currency to rise, But if the central bank does not intervene, okay, yes, there will be an appreciation in the exchange rate, but the central bank can prevent the appreciation by selling even more domestic currency and buying those dollars once again at that initial fixed exchange rate. So once again, by stepping in and in this case buying dollars and selling domestic currency, it's managing to prevent the exchange rate from appreciating. Okay, and we discussed why on both sides the central bank might want to do that. Now here is a sort of a different example. We talk about the capital flows. Okay, so we started off in our initial position, zero capital inflows. Now let's suppose that capital inflows go up. Why might that happen? Because investors all of a sudden find an attractive opportunity in the country. They say, wow, this is a great opportunity. We're going to make some money. Okay, so they come in with their dollars and they want to change their dollars for domestic currency. That places up pressures for the currency to gain value. But once again, the central bank wants to prevent that. So what does it do? It buys up their dollars and sells domestic currency at that going initial fixed exchange rate. And the way that we can think about this, let's go back to our household example. It's like, well, very often you may get a loan and initially you don't, even though ultimately you're going to spend that loan, you may not be spending that loan immediately. You can take the proceeds from that loan and you can put it into your bank account. Well, that's sort of what's happening here. We're getting some new capital inflows, and those new capital inflows we're going to take and just park them in reserves. Ultimately, they will likely get spent, but right now we're just concentrating on this initial impact. In the other direction, sometimes investors kind of sour on a country and they say, let's take our money out. Things are not looking very good here, okay? That is going to unsurprisingly place pressures on the currency to depreciate. Now, fewer people want to hold this currency. However, the central bank, once again, can prevent the currency from depreciating. How does it do that? It sells dollars, sells its foreign exchange, and buys currency at the initial going exchange rate. Okay. Now, this is something that we must note. This is something that the central bank cannot do indefinitely. Okay, the central bank has a finite amount of reserves. It's just like you will have a finite amount of money in your checking account. Okay, and if you keep drawing that down, all of a sudden people, well, for your situation, your credit agency may look at you, but if we're looking at a country, the investors, the thing that they're going to be worried about the most is losing their shirt, as it were, taking a loss from a depreciation of the currency. So if you're holding, let's say, pesos, and all of a sudden the pesos become less valuable because the central bank has decided that it is not going to defend the exchange rate anymore, and you are holding pesos, now your pesos are worth less, you have lost money. So the idea is that if people who are holding peso assets get some fears, they look around and they say, well, golly gee, there's likely a chance that the fixed peso exchange rate will become unhinged. We want to get out first. We want to get out before this happens. So that's what we call a speculative attack on the exchange rate, because you want to be out. You want to be out of there before all of the other investors. You want to take your peso assets and you want to sell them as quickly as possible at the initial fixed exchange rate, and get your dollars and leave before everybody else does. But it turns out that if everybody else is doing the same thing, life becomes very difficult. That's what we call a speculative attack. So the bottom lines here is that the central bank's foreign exchange transactions, they're sort of the counterpart, the mechanism by which the exchange rate is fixed. And we talked about how the central bank will sell foreign currency and buy domestic currency in order, for example, to keep the exchange rate from depreciating. And the other bottom line is that you can have pressures on the currency to appreciate or depreciate, either from the goods and services standpoint, net exports, or from the financing side, the net capital flows. Okay, I hope that this clarifies things for you. Thank you.